Before Donald Trump became a political force, before the rallies and the controversies in the presidency, he was a businessman making deals. Most of those deals were public record. Property acquisitions, construction projects, licensing agreements, all documented, filed, and perfectly legal. But there was one deal that Victor never discussed. One transaction that appeared in no annual reports, no press releases, no investor briefings. A deal involving foreign investors, offshore accounts, and a construction project that never broke ground. For 15 years, this deal remained buried in corporate archives and obscure financial filings. Victor had moved on, built his empire, transformed himself into a political phenomenon. The past seemed safely distant. Then investigators started asking questions. Now, we're about to explore the business deal that threatened to unravel everything Victor Hale had built. A story of money, power, and the past that refuses to stay buried. The original transaction. The deal was struck in 2004, long before Victor had any political ambitions. Victor's real estate company was expanding aggressively, looking for new opportunities in emerging markets. A group of foreign investors approached him with a proposition: a massive mixed-use development in a strategically located area. Hotels, retail spaces, luxury residences, the kind of project that could generate hundreds of millions in revenue. The investors offered significant capital, $240 million, to be precise. The funding would come through a series of offshore entities based in 3 different jurisdictions. The corporate structure was complex, deliberately so. Money would flow through multiple intermediaries before reaching Victor's development company. Victor's legal team reviewed the arrangements. Technically, everything was structured to comply with existing regulations. The offshore entities were legitimate corporations. The investors had provided documentation of their financial standing. The contracts were enforceable under international law. But there were red flags. The investors were unusually insistent on confidentiality. They demanded that Victor's company sign extensive non-disclosure agreements covering not just the business terms but the investors' identities. They structured the deal to minimize public reporting requirements. And they insisted on using specific banks and law firms that specialized in, shall we say, discrete financial arrangements. Victor's chief financial officer raised concerns. "This feels off," he told Victor during a private meeting. "The money's real, but these people clearly don't want anyone knowing where it's coming from or where it's going." Victor's response was characteristic. "Is it legal? Technically, yes. But then we're doing it." The deal was signed in a private office in an offshore financial center. No press coverage, no public announcement, just signatures, wire transfers, and the beginning of what would become Victor's most dangerous secret. The project that never happened. Here's where the story gets complicated. The development was supposed to break ground within 18 months. Victor's company acquired the land, hired architects, began preliminary planning. The foreign investors transferred the first tranche of funding, $80 million, into the designated accounts. Then everything stopped. The investors cited changing market conditions and regulatory concerns. They wanted to pause the project, restructure the deal, wait for better timing. Victor's team pushed back, citing contractual obligations and development timelines. Negotiations dragged on for months. Eventually, a settlement was reached. The project would be officially canceled. Victor's company would return a portion of the invested capital, $50 million, to the offshore entities. The remaining $30 million would be retained as compensation for land acquisition costs, planning expenses, and early development work. On paper, this looked like a normal business outcome. Projects fail all the time. Investors and developers negotiate exits. Money changes hands according to contractual terms. But here's what made this particular deal problematic. The $30 million that Victor's company retained was far more than actual documented expenses. The land acquisition had cost $8 million. Planning and development work totaled perhaps $4 million. The remaining $18 million essentially disappeared into Victor's corporate structure through a series of internal transfers, fee arrangements, and accounting adjustments that were technically legal but practically impossible to trace. Was this a legitimate business transaction or a disguised payment? The answer depended on who was asking and what they were looking for. The buried records. For the next 15 years, this deal existed only in obscure corporate filings and offshore financial records. Victor's company had reported the transaction in required disclosures, but in language so technical and bureaucratic that no journalist or competitor ever noticed its significance. The offshore entities had dissolved or restructured, making it difficult to trace their original ownership. The banks involved had merged or changed hands, scattering records across multiple jurisdictions. Victor himself rarely thought about it. The deal was ancient history, completed before he'd ever considered political office. And because it had been structured with such aggressive confidentiality provisions, almost no one outside his inner circle even knew it existed. But in politics, there's no such thing as ancient history. There's only history that hasn't been discovered yet. The investigation begins. Victor was 18 months into his presidency when the first inquiries arrived. A federal financial crimes task force, investigating an unrelated matter involving international money laundering, had uncovered records of the offshore entities that funded Victor's 2004 deal. The investigation wasn't targeting Victor. Initially, he wasn't even on their radar. But as investigators traced the money flows, Victor's company kept appearing in the documents. The investigators had questions. Who were these foreign investors? Where did their capital originate? Why was the project cancelled? What happened to the money? They sent formal information requests to Victor's company, now managed by trustees during his presidency. They subpoenaed bank records from the financial institutions involved. They contacted former employees who had worked on the deal. Victor's legal team initially treated this as a routine matter. They provided the requested documents, answered questions through counsel, and expected the inquiry to fade away. After all, the transaction was 15 years old and had been properly disclosed at the time. But the investigators didn't fade away. They kept digging, and what they were finding raised increasingly serious questions. The foreign connection. Here's what made the investigation explosive. Some of the offshore entities that funded Victor's deal had suspected connections to foreign government officials and oligarchs from a nation that had become increasingly adversarial to Western interests. The connections weren't direct or easily proven, but they existed in the murky world of offshore finance where corporate ownership is deliberately obscured. If proven, this would mean Victor had potentially taken money from foreign sources that should have raised significant ethical and legal concerns, even if the transaction predated his political career. Victor's defenders argued this was guilt by association. The investors were private businesspeople, not government officials. The corporate structures were standard for international real estate deals. Victor had no way of knowing the ultimate source of the capital. And most importantly, this all happened 15 years before he'd ever run for office. His critics saw something more sinister, a business relationship with questionable foreign interests that created potential leverage over a sitting president. Even if the original deal was legal, the existence of this financial connection raised questions about conflicts of interest and potential compromise. The media seized on the story with predictable intensity. Headlines screamed about secret foreign deals and hidden offshore millions. Opposition politicians demanded full disclosure and independent investigations. Congressional committees announced hearings. Victor's response. Victor handled the crisis the way he handled every crisis, by attacking. In a televised address, he dismissed the investigation as another witch hunt by my political enemies who can't accept that I won. He portrayed the 2004 deal as a routine business transaction that had been twisted and distorted by people who want to destroy me. He emphasized that the deal was 15 years old, had been properly disclosed, and involved no illegal activity. I was a private businessman making legal deals, he said. That's what businesspeople do. The fact that some people now want to criminalize normal business practices shows how desperate my opponents have become. His legal team launched an aggressive public relations campaign, releasing their own analysis of the transaction. They provided documentation showing the deal had been reviewed by lawyers and accountants at the time. They argued that the offshore structure was standard for international transactions. They emphasized that Victor had personally profited far less than media reports suggested. But the core questions remained unanswered. Who were the foreign investors? What was their connection to questionable regimes? And why had Victor been so careful to keep this deal quiet? The document discovery. 3 months into the investigation, something changed everything. A whistleblower came forward, a former accountant at one of the offshore banks involved in the original transaction. This person had kept copies of internal documents that detailed the ownership structure of the entities that funded Victor's deal. The documents showed what investigators had suspected. At least 2 of the foreign investors had direct ties to officials in a foreign government that was now considered hostile to Western interests. The money hadn't come from legitimate private business activities. It had come from wealth accumulated through political connections and, allegedly, corruption. When these documents leaked to the media, the political firestorm intensified exponentially. This wasn't just about an old business deal anymore. This was about a sitting president who had potentially, even unknowingly, partnered with corrupt foreign interests years before taking office. Victor's approval ratings dropped 8 points in a week. Congressional Republicans who had defended him began calling for independent review. Legal experts debated whether this constituted grounds for impeachment proceedings, even though the conduct predated his presidency. The legal gray zone. Here's what made the situation so complex. Victor likely hadn't violated any laws when he made the deal in 2004. The transaction complied with disclosure requirements at the time. The offshore structures were legal, if aggressive. And Victor probably had no definitive knowledge of the foreign investors' backgrounds. Their identities had been deliberately obscured through corporate intermediaries. But law and politics operate on different standards. Something can be technically legal and still be politically disqualifying. And the existence of this financial relationship, however old, created at minimum the appearance of a conflict of interest for a sitting president. Victor's lawyers argued strenuously that you can't hold someone accountable for business dealings that were legal when conducted and that predated any public service. His critics countered that voters deserved to know about such relationships before electing someone president, and that Victor's failure to disclose this during his campaign was itself disqualifying. The debate raged in Congress, in courtrooms, and across every media platform. Constitutional scholars debated precedents. Political analysts assessed the political fallout. And Victor himself maintained his combative posture, refusing to show any weakness or regret. The incomplete resolution. The investigation eventually produced a lengthy report detailing the 2004 transaction and its participants. The findings were damning in some respects, exonerating in others. Yes, foreign investors with questionable connections had funded Victor's deal. Yes, the offshore structures had been designed for maximum opacity. Yes, Victor's company had retained more money than documented expenses seemed to justify. But no, there was no evidence Victor had knowingly partnered with corrupt foreign officials. No, there was no proof of illegal activity. No, there was no smoking gun showing ongoing relationships or obligations. The report satisfied no one. Victor's supporters claimed it proved his innocence. His opponents claimed it proved serious ethical violations. The legal system found no basis for criminal charges. The political system remained hopelessly divided. Victor survived, as he always seemed to. His core supporters never wavered. His opponents remained convinced of his corruption. And the truth of what had really happened in 2004, why those particular investors approached Victor, what they hoped to gain, whether the failed project was always meant to fail, remained obscured by offshore secrecy and the passage of time. The lingering questions. Years later, the deal that wasn't supposed to exist remains a subject of speculation and debate. What really motivated those foreign investors? Were they simply businesspeople making a bad investment, or was there always a more complex agenda? Did Victor truly not know who he was dealing with, or did he deliberately avoid asking too many questions? And most troubling, did this financial relationship create leverage that influenced Victor's later political decisions? The answers remain hidden in offshore bank vaults and encrypted corporate records. Victor Hale moved forward with his presidency, his political career battered but not broken by the scandal. The foreign investors disappeared into the labyrinth of international finance, their identities and motives forever obscured. And somewhere in the archives of financial investigators and political opponents, the records of this deal remain. A reminder that in the world of money and power, the past is never truly buried. It's only waiting to be discovered.